Hey everybody, welcome to our Facebook Live. So much to talk about with regard to the coronavirus pandemic. I know that there's a lot of questions that have come in just over the last few days about what's going on as states start to reopen. There's a question about the impact of the social justice protests in terms of infection rates. There's questions about what happened after Memorial Day weekend. And I want to talk about that. I also want to talk about something that's been in the news quite a bit lately, and it's this question of asymptomatic spread. Now, first of all, I think a lot of people know this term by now, but asymptomatic spread. Symptomatic means you have symptoms. Asymptomatic means you don't have symptoms. And this has long been a concern with this particular infection. You think about it, a lot of respiratory infections, if you are sick, if you are symptomatic, having symptoms, cough, sneezing, fever, whatever, hopefully you stay home. So that you can recover, but also so that you can reduce the spread. That's the way things typically work. What we learned pretty early on, I did an interview with the head of the CDC back in early February, late January, I can't even remember, where he basically talked about the fact that there was now evidence of asymptomatic spread. So there were people who got secondary infections who came in contact with someone who was not showing any symptoms. So think about it like this. Someone is in the household. They don't have any symptoms. They've been out and about. They come home. Somebody else in the household who's not been out and about becomes infected. They go, they test, and they realize that the primary person is infected but is having no symptoms. That's how they first generated the idea that there was asymptomatic spread. And then they started to see it more and more in other places around the country, around the world. And some estimates are that 25 to 40% of people who have the infection have no symptoms and could still be spreading it. Now, there's 2 points I want to make here. One is that those are harder studies to do. Why is that? That's because mostly the people that are getting tested are people who have symptoms still. We should be doing more surveillance testing, getting an idea of how widespread this is in the community. But if most of the people who are getting tested have symptoms, it's harder to find evidence of asymptomatic spread, but it is there. The other point is this distinction between what is known as asymptomatic spread and then pre-symptomatic spread. That's going to mean exactly what you think. Again, asymptomatic, someone has the virus, they don't have symptoms, they never develop symptoms. They would be surprised, weeks, months later to be told, you had the virus, you have antibodies to the virus. They would say, I'm totally shocked. I felt fine. I never had any symptoms throughout. Pre-symptomatic means they don't know it yet, but they're about to develop symptoms. And what is interesting about that is that in the period of time, the day or two before someone develops symptoms, there's now some early evidence that that is when they are in fact most contagious. So pre-symptomatic spread is a concerning thing. What does this mean for the country? What does this mean for the world in terms of controlling this virus? It is very true and very possible that there are people out there who spread the virus while they don't have any symptoms. They don't have any symptoms at the time. That's the key thing to know. That is why since January, February, March, whenever, we've been saying, a lot of people have been saying, you have to behave like you have the virus. You don't know, especially if you haven't been tested. You have to behave like you have the virus. That means keeping your physical distance if you're out and about, wearing a mask if you can't keep that physical distance, all the things that we've been talking about. Again, with a lot of other respiratory viruses, they would be easier to contain because it'd be really easy to see that guy has symptoms, that woman has symptoms. We can test, verify, isolate, trace the contacts, do all that stuff. But if someone never has symptoms, then how do you go about actually trying to contain this? The answer, short of a vaccine, which is something else I want to talk about, is that you start to actually test. You do surveillance. You try to figure out who's infected, who's not. Make sure you can isolate people who are infected and trace their contacts. Again, if they don't have symptoms, they're not going to be necessarily putting their hand up and saying, I want to get tested. That's why you start to do surveillance testing. I want to talk about the vaccine in a second, but so many questions coming in. This is from Elizabeth. Are you contagious if you test positive for antibodies but are asymptomatic? Great question. So let me just reiterate again. There's the diagnostic test. And in a way, that's testing for the presence of the virus itself. It's actually testing for a portion of the blueprint of the virus. But the point is this: you're trying to find, is the virus actually present, active in the body at the time? Antibodies are your body's reaction to the virus. They show up after the infection, typically. At least one of the antibodies does. So if you have presence of the antibodies, that typically means at some point in the past you were infected, but you probably don't have active infection right now. So the answer to your question, Elizabeth, is you should not be contagious if you just tested positive for the antibodies and are asymptomatic. Okay. Jack asks, do asymptomatic people heal on their own without medication? Another great question. And this is a fundamental question. Your body typically, unless you are someone who has a weakened immune system because of age, because of pre-existing condition, your body should be able to deal with this virus, clear the virus. Keep in mind, I don't say kill the virus. Why? Because the virus is not really alive. The virus is not something you can kill because it's not really alive. It's sort of the zombie of pathogens. It needs you to be alive. It needs a host to be alive. So I say clear the virus, or you get the virus out of your body. And that's typically what happens, is that the virus will clear from your body. Your body's own immune system will deal with it. The vaccine, again, which I'll talk about in a moment, is to basically create even more antibodies so that as soon as the virus is seen, the body sort of takes over and deals with it. Most of us do this well on our own. But as we know, for about 20% of people, they can become sick. Some of them can become quite sick, even critically ill. So that's really the issue that we're talking about here. Eileen asks, if you come in brief contact, like in a grocery store, can you contract the virus? So another good question here. Contact tracing is predicated on the idea of defining what does it mean to be a contact. Let's say you have the virus. Let's say you're asymptomatic. You don't know you have the virus. You get tested afterward and you find out you have the virus, and now they say, well, we need to contact trace you. What qualifies as a close contact? It's a little bit arbitrary, but let me give you a framework for thinking about it. We talk about distance, and that's usually within 1 to 2 meters. That's where the 6 feet comes from. Have you been in contact with people in a sort of a closer range? That's one question they're going to ask. 2 is, how long were you in close contact? If you just walk by somebody quickly in a grocery store or somewhere else, they're probably not going to be a close contact. Typically, it's defined somewhere around 10 to 15 minutes. It'll be shorter if you went up and gave the person a hug and you're really close to the person. It'll be a longer duration would count if you sort of kept some distance and it was more of just a social, quick, sort of greeting. So distance and duration. One of the other questions they're going to ask, were you wearing a mask? If you wear a mask, early evidence shows it decreases the likelihood of transmission by about 6-fold. So contact tracers will ask that question. They're also going to ask about your environment. Were you inside or were you outside? The reason they ask that, I think a lot of people know now, is because the virus is going to disperse more easily in the outdoor environment. So again, early evidence, these things aren't terribly easy to study, but they say it's about an 18-fold decrease in transmission if you're outside versus inside. So the worst scenario, you're closely clustered inside without a mask, and you're doing it for a long period of time, that would be definitely a close contact. Best case scenario would be you'd be outside, keeping physical distance. Hopefully people would be wearing masks, and you don't have long duration. Okay, so that gives you an idea about contacts. Really, really great question. Derek asks, will there be another large outbreak with reopening everything? Derek, I think the best way to answer that question is that, first of all, the virus has not changed. We know that. There's been some speculation that the virus will become less contagious. Maybe that'll happen, but there's not really evidence of that yet. It's still a contagious virus. It's out there. When we started to close things down and recommend people stay at home, there were fewer than 80 people who had died in this country, and about 4,500, between 4,000 and 5,000 people who have been infected. Now we're talking about nearly 2 million people who've been infected, and more than 100,000, 110,000 people who have died. I mean, those are mind-boggling numbers for sure. I think the thing to keep in mind is, so if you shut things down when the numbers are so low and you're reopening when the numbers are so high, and the virus hasn't changed, I think it's pretty clear that the numbers will continue to go up. So right now, if you say we have 20,000 new infections a day, we have somewhere, again, sad numbers, hundreds, sometimes 1,000, sometimes even higher number of people who die every day from this virus. Will that go to this and go to from 20 to 30,000 and more than 1,000 people dying every day? Or will it go into exponential growth, meaning all of a sudden the curve starts to really tick upward, which can happen because a few people who are infected, again, maybe asymptomatic, start to spread, create super spreading events. One person spreads it to 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 even, and then they start spreading it. You can get into tens of thousands of people becoming infected very quickly in one area. So you may have evidence of exponential growth in certain communities. You may have increased infection in certain communities, but they're able to still keep it from going into exponential growth. We're going to see. There's 2 things that I think are important, again, short of a vaccine. If you have widespread, accurate, easily available testing, that would make a huge difference, number one. Number 2 is, I think in the back of people's minds, whether it be at the community level, the state level, going to have some idea as to what qualifies as a trigger to start shutting things down. They just did this in Israel. Israel was sort of plugging along. They had done a great job, and then they saw that the number of people infected started to go way up. The number of people in the hospital and critical care started to go way up, and they started to shut things down again. In Arizona, they're activating their emergency plan because their ICU bed capacity is starting to reach critical levels. North Carolina has had some of the highest rates of hospitalizations that they've had throughout this pandemic. So clearly, Derek, I think things are getting worse in some places, as was expected. As was expected. The question is how much worse and what are we willing to tolerate? I think that's going to be the big question here as we go forward. And also, what are the potential triggers as we start to reopen that would force or at least make us think about possibly having to shut things down again? These are not easy questions. They don't have easy answers. It may be done on a community by community level as well. I still talk about testing a lot. I will always talk about testing. If we had more widespread available, accurate testing, I think it would obviate a lot of these discussions. Joseph, is it smart to open college campuses in the fall? It's a good question again, Joseph. And there are college campuses that are going to be opening. I spoke to Father John Jenkins at Notre Dame. They're planning on opening with a really robust testing program. They're going to have special places within the university campus to isolate. They're going to identify people who are considered vulnerable populations and try and keep them separate from people who may be asymptomatic carriers. It's going to be a plan that every university is going to have. I would draw a distinction, Joseph, between college campuses and primary schools. College campuses are tough. I mean, college students, they move around a lot. Even before this pandemic, you did see outbreaks of various things like meningitis on college campuses. So I think it's going to be more challenging on a college campus. And again, what is the trigger to basically have to shut things down and go back to online learning? Primary schools, kids are lower risk of getting infected, lower risk of getting very sick. So there may be a difference there, but it's going to look different no matter what. Class sizes will have to be reduced, space between the desks, no big gatherings. They're going to have to do, some sort of regular testing. They talk about temperature checks, which are helpful, but I think, as you can probably tell from this discussion, by no means a panacea. If people are asymptomatic and still able to spread, temperature checks are only going to give you so much information. Let's see here. Santhoth. I always want to make sure I say names correctly. Santhoth. Santhoth. What precautions can we take when going for a haircut to reduce the chance of contracting the virus? Well, I don't know if you can tell. My hair, Santhoth, is I've not got it cut. I'm getting teased a lot by 3 teenage daughters in the house, as you might imagine. They've come up with all sorts of nicknames, which I will not share with you here. Maybe our next Facebook Live. But look, I think life is a risk-reward proposition. I'm not getting a haircut because I think it's tough for me to authentically, genuinely say to the person cutting my hair, even if I'm wearing a mask, that there's not some risk here. You're going to be in very close proximity. You're going to be doing it for a duration longer than 15 minutes. Those are risk factors. You're going to likely be inside. Those are risk factors. I know you decontaminate surfaces and all of that. You do everything you can. If your person who's cutting your hair is wearing a mask, you're wearing a mask, that obviously helps. I just think it's a risk reward proposition. And for every single person, it's going to be a different level of risk. I've chosen not to do that because I want to make sure I don't inadvertently spread the virus to somebody. What would change that equation? I think everybody knows the answer to this by now. Testing. If we could have testing, if I could get tested and know I'm not harboring the virus, at least today, the person cutting my hair is not harboring the virus, at least today, that would be helpful. I realize that tomorrow the test result may come back positive. It's a point in time that you're getting the test result. Maybe I got a test result for antibodies and a good test, and it shows that I have antibodies. I would feel more comfortable at that point that I'm not likely to be infected and spread the virus, as was asked earlier by Eileen. So I think that if we get to that point where we have good, accurate, widespread testing, it would answer so many of these questions that are coming in. Crystal asks, didn't they just put out a report stating that there's no evidence of asymptomatic people spreading the virus? Yes, Crystal, this was the first point I wanted to make today, and the World Health Organization did say this. It wasn't a report. One of the scientists there was actually responding to a question, and I think the point she was making, Maria Van Kerkhove, was that there's not a lot of evidence to show secondary spread from asymptomatic people. That may be true, but there is spread from asymptomatic people. It does happen, and there's spread certainly from pre-symptomatic people. As I said, people who are pre-symptomatic right before they develop symptoms may in fact be the most contagious. So keep that in mind. World Health Organization has sort of walked back their comments about dismissing asymptomatic spread. Dr. Fauci was also talking about this today, saying that he was strong in his language. He said it was wrong. He said what they said was wrong. Asymptomatic spread can happen. Pre-symptomatic spread can happen. Those are both concerns. This should in no way be a signal that you don't need to be careful, even if you feel fine. You still need to behave like you have the virus, and people around you still need to behave like they have the virus. Michael asks, is there a reliable antibody test yet? That's a good question. I'm not sure I know the most up-to-date. Antibody tests have been notoriously poor at giving you accurate results. With an antibody test, the thing that you don't want to have is a false positive result. You don't want to be told, yes, you have the antibodies, when in fact you don't. Now, we don't know how protective the antibodies are because the antibodies, provide some protection, but how long or how strong that protection is, we're still not sure. But if you have the antibody test, it's a good test, it's an accurate test, and you get a positive result. I think that's going to be, somewhat reassuring. So I think there's several tests out there under emergency use authorization. The diagnostic tests for the virus itself, there's many more of those out there. We need to get to the point where we have safe, accurate testing. And I don't know that we can say that for the antibody test. I got my antibodies tested at a university. They took it, they took my blood. Antibody test requires blood. Diagnostic test requires either a swab or saliva or something like that. And we've got to get to the point where we can have those types of tests widely available. I'm going to keep beating the drum on this issue because everyone keeps talking about the vaccine, which is important. But the idea of having some physical evidence that you don't have the virus, and frankly, having the psychological confidence to say, today at least, I'm not harboring the virus. If I'm being careful, then I can get tested every couple of weeks and be confident that I'm not harboring the virus. Let me answer this question because this will get me to the last point I want to make today. Syed is asking, when do we expect that the vaccine will be out? Well, give you a little context, first of all. There's a lot of infections out there, viral infections like hepatitis C, HIV, AIDS, for which we don't have a vaccine, despite decades of trying. I don't say that to be pessimistic. I say that to be realistic. It is not a done deal that we're going to have a vaccine. We hope so. Everybody, I think, on the planet, at least the majority of the planet, hopes so. But it's not for sure that we're going to have a vaccine. we are moving at, I think, what can authentically be called record speed right now. Vaccines can take years, if not decades, to create. And if you think about it, the genomic sequence for this virus, this novel coronavirus, I think was shared with the world, I'm going to say mid-January, January 12th, January 13th timeframe. If you talk to scientists at Inovia, they'll say within 3 hours, they had the blueprint for a vaccine. You talk to scientists at NIH, they were able to send over an optimized gene for the coronavirus vaccine within a couple of days. So it's really moving quite quickly. I think we hear that by next month, first week of July, at least one vaccine company, Moderna, in conjunction with the NIH, will be putting their vaccine in phase 3 clinical trials, basically giving tens of thousands of people the vaccine, tens of thousands of people, similar community, similar sort of exposure rates, not giving them the vaccine. It still remains safe. In the early trials, you're giving it to young, healthy people for the most part. That's who volunteers. In the bigger trials, older people, people who have pre-existing conditions. There's other people who obviously would need this vaccine as well. So does it work for them? Is it safe for them? Those are the two questions that the phase 3 clinical trials are going to try and answer. And that just takes time. That just takes time. It takes finding places around the world where the virus is rapidly spreading, like in the United States, but also in South Africa and Brazil, where there's other these other trial sites, and really following these people for a period of time, seeing, am I getting signals of efficacy? Yeah, this population of people that got the vaccine, they're really not getting infected. They're not getting sick. The population of people that did not get the vaccine, they are getting sick or infected at higher rates. Do you see those efficacy signals? Do you see the safety signals? These people don't seem to have any more side effects over here that got the vaccine compared to people who didn't. My point is this, that as fast as the platforms work for these various vaccines, and we've talked about all the different types of vaccines, the mRNA, that's essentially a RNA of a portion of the virus that's used as a vaccine to inactivated virus itself as the vaccine. There's also different platforms. They're testing these now, and if you look at them, Syed, this is the answer to your question. There is some possibility that by the end of the year or early next year, we could start to see vaccine. In order for that to work, in order for it to be available to you, Syed, to me, to anybody else who wants it or needs it, they would have to start basically manufacturing that vaccine before they knew for sure that it was going to pass successfully through phase 3 trials. That's a big deal. I mean, that's first of all a lot of money. It requires these companies to start to do lots of manufacturing on a gamble, essentially, which is why the federal government in this country, along with other places, is starting to support some of the manufacturing of these vaccines ahead of time, saying we know it's a risk, we know it's a gamble, we're going to take our chances, and we're going to bet on a few of them and see what happens. In the end, there may be more than one vaccine that would be available. That would be great. The other part of this, and this is a longer conversation, maybe we can do this at the next Facebook Live, is would you get the vaccine? I hope that the message, as we talk about the expeditious nature of this vaccine, isn't that it sounds too risky. I get that could be the sentiment. Well, these guys are rushing things. Is it going to be safe? Is it going to make people sick? Valid concerns. And by the way, that's happened before. There was a vaccine that actually caused problems. This is back, I'm going to say, in the mid-70s. Gerald Ford was president, and there were hundreds of people who developed terrible side effects from that vaccine, a condition known as Guillain-Barré syndrome, which essentially is an ascending paralysis of the body. Don't want that to happen. And I think it's going to be incumbent on, frankly, the scientists, obviously, the public health officials and reporters like me to stay dogged about that particular point. And I will. If there's problems with these vaccines, if there's side effects, if there's things like that the public should know, that needs to be disclosed. And we cannot risk safety, public safety, in a rush to get the vaccine. I spoke to Dr. Anthony Fauci about that this morning, and I can just tell you that they think the same way. So hopefully it'll be available, it'll be safe, and it'll be done as quickly as possible. I think we're going to leave it there. It's about a half an hour. Please continue to listen to the podcast. I appreciate it. Millions of you have downloaded this podcast just over the past few weeks. Thank you for that. Coronavirus Fact versus Fiction. And I know that we haven't been reporting on the pandemic as much over the last couple of weeks because there's been so much news around these social justice protests, which are also very important. It's been a interesting time because I look at those protests and I recognize the importance, the historical sort of significance of what's happening in the country right now. But I also recognize that it's a public health concern. That's the truth. It is a public health concern to see these protests. People in close proximity for long periods of time. Yes, they're outside. That's beneficial. Yes, a significant percentage wearing masks. That's beneficial. But there's no doubt we're going to see more and more people who are becoming infected. So we're all in this together. We're going to get through this together. I'm confident of that. I know that that's the case. I hope you keep listening, keep talking, keep sending in your questions. Thanks a lot.